Today's podcast is on trade reforms with guest speaker Anushka Wijesinha, and it's hosted by Deane Jayamanne, our very own director at the Advocata Institute.
Anush, welcome to the Advocata podcast.
Great to be here, Deane.
Nice to have you. So let me just quickly dive into the topic that we want to talk about. You are an expert in trade. You've spent a lot of time both in government and consulting. And you've spent a lot of time thinking about Sri Lanka and its trade policy. So I want to first ask you about how would you characterize the changes in Sri Lankan trade policy over the years? We've had a number of things that have happened, both big events and small. How would you kind of describe our trade policy at the moment?
Yeah, a lot of words come to mind. Topsy-turvy is one. Probably more recently, I would characterize our trade policy as being quite inward-oriented, protectionist. We've regressed because Sri Lanka was one of the first countries to open up to trade. We were one of the first countries to have very strong pieces of legislation that are setting the foundation for exports, like the Sri Lanka Export Development Act in 1979, which is even today, with some of the partners I work with overseas, look at that as a pioneering model. We had the Board of Investment as an agency to promote FDI, particularly export-oriented FDI. And then, we also had almost broad bipartisan support for being a more export-oriented, trade-oriented economy. But more recently, as we know, we've regressed. And I think now the only way to characterize it is as inward-looking, as protectionist, but also in a way not in step with the rest of the world, including countries of our size, of our level of development, completely contrary to where most countries are heading. So it's almost an outlier in the kind of trade policy that we've chosen to pursue.
Mm. That seems almost kind of contrary to popular perception inside Sri Lanka, right? So we think about Sri Lanka having opened its economy in 1977, and sort of at least the mainstream story outside of perhaps academic circles have been we have been an open economy ever since. So if you were to put a kind of a timeline into how these changes took place, how would you describe that? Okay, 77 was a big event that we all know. And in the 90s, Sri Lanka was a fairly open economy in the sense, like you said, compared to others, right? Because all this is relative. And we had a globalization period that was happening in the 90s everywhere. So where did really things started changing?
So you're right about post-1977, post-1990, which is, sort of the so-called second wave of reforms. And then I must say, the heightening conflict, the armed conflict, did suck up a lot of oxygen in the room in terms of both policy attention, but also resources, right? So financing of new initiatives that could have promoted exports, improved our borders, attention that policymakers and public officials had. So I think that was also in large part. But throughout that time, we were still broadly outward-oriented. There weren't overt protectionist policies. We kept tinkering on the margins, and a lot of it was to do also with taxation, the need to collect revenue from this easy base of indirect taxes at the border. But something changed in the mid-2000s and latter part of 2000s, where the political establishment at the time and the party orientation, personalities in government had a very different economic ideology. And in a way, it was oxymoronic, because on one hand, we heard about these 5 hubs, some of which were, arguably outward oriented in nature or needed to be. But at the same time, we saw a trade policy that was slowly becoming more skewed to supporting domestic industry. Right? And I think that only accelerated with the end of the war and this heavy public infrastructure drive, debt-fueled public infrastructure drive, which created a whole bunch of incentives around focusing on the domestic economy. You had an emergence of new firms that were making a lot of money from focusing on the domestic non-tradable sector. So I think that then spiraled. It fed into both a narrative of growth, that this infrastructure-driven growth, non-tradable-driven growth is the future. It also fueled a feedback loop between, I think, the private sector and government, because the more money was being made there was more incentive for the private sector to lobby for further policy orientation towards that, which then the government kept delivering on. So I think that was a distinct shift point in time. And then we saw in 2015 some attempts to try and reverse that. And that's the period of time that I got also excited and decided to work in government. And we did manage to do some things, but I think both the entrenched interests as well as the extent of the reform that needed to be done, we just didn't get far enough. So I think we may have pushed back a little bit on that inward-oriented trend that we saw, but it certainly wasn't enough to really breach that barrier. And now I think another more recent turning point was with the onset of the pandemic, where even as other countries did introduce some trade barriers, some of them, of course, on the export side, export restrictions on PPE and so on, which Sri Lanka didn't do. But for preserving balance of payments and so on, some countries also did curb imports, but they also took it off.
Right.
And
this is in the recent crisis,
exactly,
COVID, etc.
2020.
Okay.
And what we saw with Sri Lanka was that these trade policy measures that were ostensibly taken to fight the crisis very quickly became de facto industrial policy.
Right.
And, one can almost forgive policymakers if it was a determined, well thought through attempt to go from those measures to de facto industrial policy, but it wasn't. Yeah. It just stumbled. Yeah. They just stumbled into it. So I think that was, in terms of time periods, I would say that was the last. And comparing to other countries that took smaller trade measures and then had a sunset on those after the initial crisis was over, those have now become de facto industrial policy. So you almost have a further reinforcement of that inward-looking trade policy.
Yeah. So I remember kind of how I think maybe both of us were kind of in our school days when that whole rhetoric changed to unplugging from the world and this plug galavim and all that sort of stuff. So that rhetoric change happened in I think about 2004 with a certain political change that accompanied it. So would you say that, one of the things that some of our friends who promote industrial policy says is like, look, this wasn't industrial policy. It was just, the needing of tax revenue and then just you erect a bunch of tariffs. And it wasn't a kind of well thought through industrial policy. So it was even inward looking policy done wrong. And then it kind of ended up in what you were talking about in kind of entrenched interests who now make supernormal profits. So would you say that in your experience in government, when you try to undo some of this stuff, can you talk to a little bit about how that was?
Yeah, so a couple of things. We have to look at, to be fair, by some parts of the business community, they have lost faith in the ability of the country and the government to create a level playing field. And I know this word level playing field is used a lot, so I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I've interacted with businesses, including exporters, who do very well in international markets, but at the same time are some of the most ardent proponents of Sri Lanka becoming more protectionist. Some of them are doing so for very silly ideological reasons and baseless, but some also do it because they feel that there isn't a level playing field. And that speaks to Sri Lanka's lack of improvement and sophistication with border procedures, or gaps in the regulatory regime for imports. And that's a real problem. So, for example, when Sri Lanka moved to the NMRA Act, National Medicinal Regulatory Authority, Act, and that came from the Cosmetic Devices and Drugs Authority Act. It became NMRA. There was this big gaping hole for cosmetic products.
Right.
So the drafters, the public officials who came up with that change kind of forgot about that. So we saw a lot of manufacturers in that space of cosmetics and related products pushing back on any trade reform, any outward orientation, because they were angry about this one piece. And rightly so, because they saw poorly regulated products coming in, uneven playing field. So that narrow experience then informed their overall view, perception, attitude towards trade in general.
Right.
So the point I want to make there is on the first point, we didn't do enough to have that entire regulatory regime evolve over time, and there were too many of these gaps, too many feelings of that uneven playing field, government not being effective enough in those spaces. But of course, on the other, it really was this idea that if the policy regime is going to be skewed in favor of domestic industries, if we can go and lobby a minister and get those advantages, we can make it work. And capital was following, right? So you have even the financial sector very happy to lend to these businesses that were able to show supernormal profits because they basically had a easy canvas to work with. Right. There was very little risk of those businesses failing because you were operating under an explicit protection regime. So I think in part it was just that policy skewing which then fed all of those incentives. I guess one other thought, reflection I would have, I guess, looking back at my time in government, is that we didn't do, and I think to this day not many people have done, reminding folks with numbers, reminding folks that the export-oriented sector and the trade-oriented sector writ large has a premium. So even wage premiums, we were working with the World Bank to show that an employee in an export-oriented firm has a significant wage premium over a comparable employee in a non-export-oriented firm.
Yeah.
And those are kind of the data points that we should have been talking about to remind everyone that exports is good for the economy, trade is good for the economy. So yeah, I think that would be a reflection I have.
So all this has meant that Sri Lanka's export basket has kind of remained static for a long time. So I think a lot of policy circles, we talk about it and how do you diversify this export basket. So now that we are in the situation we are in, how do you kind of move forward? What are some of the tools that are available for policymakers to basically get out of this rut?
So before I get to what are some of those tools and initiatives, the first thing to set out is that at a headline level, you're absolutely right. There's been very little diversification. So if you just simply look, and I'd encourage everyone to use this very easy tool that the Harvard Center for International Development developed. It's called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and you can easily map over a time period across countries how that export basket has changed. And you compare Sri Lanka's to, say, Thailand or Vietnam. Over 20 years, the picture has dramatically changed.
Right.
From agricultural goods to light manufacturing to high value manufacturing in electronics and so on. In Sri Lanka, that picture has changed very little, certainly not as dramatic. But at the margin, there has been diversification.
Right.
So now, thinking about the kind of products that Sri Lanka exports, you have Sri Lankan exporters in automobile and electronics global supply chains, manufacturing for some of the biggest companies in the world. We have even within traditional sectors. So I think that's a cautionary note when you look at some of these maps. Even if you are in a traditional sector, say coconut or spices, but you're doing very high-end things.
Yeah.
For example, in spices, very high-value extracts for the nutraceuticals or pharmaceuticals or perfume industry, it still gets clubbed in your in that agriculture box. So I think within some of the traditional segments, at the margin, Sri Lankan companies have diversified. And even outside of those sectors, Sri Lanka companies have diversified going into, electronic components, automobile components, and so on. But it's not the norm, right? It's somewhat of the exception. In terms of moving forward, drawing from what we see there, a big determinant has been FDI, export-oriented FDI, either greenfield or joint ventures. I think moving forward, the number one priority has to be, in order to see the kind of dramatic shift that we see with our competitors, bringing in export-oriented FDI to partner with Sri Lankan firms or greenfield who will take us into these new diversified product categories, into new global supply chains. And I think that's where, as much as the trade policy has been skewed inward, I think FDI policy has very much favored, again, domestic non-tradables, property development, real estate, and understanding that the incentives, and here I mean in a crude form, fiscal incentives, the kind of fiscal incentives that are looked at by, say, a market-seeking FDI, like a real estate property kind of project, versus an efficiency-seeking FDI, which is in exports, is quite different.
Right.
And our FDI promotion agencies and those in charge of that really haven't understood that, and you keep, flogging the same horse. So I would say the first priority is export-oriented FDI. The second is, and I don't have an answer on the how, is unlocking some of the, what I would call, inefficient capital that is locked in with very competent Sri Lankan businesses who are focusing on the domestic market.
Right.
So some of the work that I'm doing now takes me to other countries in the region, and I see a lot of very competent, well-capitalized businesses in those countries having moved into export-oriented businesses with those surpluses that they generate.
Right.
In Sri Lanka, we see those, not, I wouldn't say all, but a lot of those high-end top businesses that have access to capital, that have good management, doing more and more internally, more and more domestic, non-tradable activity. And that goes back to the point about why would they do that? And the question is, why wouldn't they when the going is so great? So I think by changing that policy regime to be more outward-oriented, it's going to signal to the financial sector, to capital, where capital is, and to those businesses, where should I be investing that next extra rupee or extra dollar? Removing the highly attractive domestic non-tradable space, I think would shift them towards that. And I think it's a real shame that we have well-run businesses that could perform very well globally, locking their capital in this inward-looking, domestic, non-tradable kind of sectors.
Yeah. So I mean, the narrative in the last few years have been this: yes, export is good, but imports are kind of bad, right? That has been the sort of, I would say, dominant narrative in Sri Lankan sort of mainstream debate outside of perhaps academic circles. And I think this is something that is genuinely not understood. That fact is that you have limited resources, and if you don't kind of take the punt on a risky export, and you're rather happy just doing import substitution where you have a captured market, that's where all the resources are going. Labor and capital is going there. So I think that's a very important point that you bring out, that I think is not understood well, which is that the more domestic production you do, the less resources you will end up for having these risky. And entrepreneurship really doesn't work, because why would you take those risks?
Exactly. I mean, the risks just don't make sense because it's so comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm surprised more people haven't realized, and perhaps they will with this crisis, because as much as it's a foreign reserves crisis, it's a fiscal crisis,
Yeah.
is that to fuel that kind of domestic, non-tradable driven growth, Sri Lanka has relied on the government budget.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if you just look at, so I have a role in a listed commercial bank, and I can see how worried we are every time we hear about an unsustainable fiscal deficit, because then you're thinking this is going to constrain the treasury's cash flows. It's going to mean suppliers are not going to get paid. And what do I mean by suppliers? Those big construction projects that the state has spent on, whole ecosystem of our private sector that relies on the national budget.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when the national budget is constrained, those businesses are constrained. And we've seen this in the last few years. So I would hope that this crisis signals to that private sector that it's not sustainable, and they are at risk and they are vulnerable when the budget is vulnerable. So surely, doesn't it make more sense to now rely less and less on the excesses of the exchequer, and go after new opportunities? But I must say it's not easy, right? And I think it's easy to say more people should export, but it's not easy. And I hope we can talk about that later, about what it would take for us to really grow our exports. It's not going to happen automatically.
Right.
But again, to reiterate, I think one of the first fundamental things is to shift this skewed policy regime away from how it helps comfortable domestic non-tradable sectors to breaking out into new export sectors. And private sector takes a signal from where government policy is headed.
Mm-hmm.
And on that, I think it can't be half-hearted, because if the private sector knows that this government is planning on opening up, liberalizing, but it's only going to last as long as this government or this trade
Right.
minister or this
Yeah.
prime minister or this finance minister, they know, okay, maybe I'll wait it out. I'll
Right.
try to lobby a little bit, but I know this is going to get reversed.
Mm.
So you're not taking actual decisions about where to deploy your capital, where to invest that next rupee or the next dollar, because you know that it's going to get reversed. So in order to have a step change, people have to believe it to
Right.
really change behavior. And for that, we have to anchor some of these reforms. It can't just be with, gazettes that get moved around or overnight regulations. It has to be anchored.
So how do you anchor these?
So I think it's time that Sri Lanka really moves beyond these policies. There was a new trade policy last time. These are soft.
Mm-hmm.
We have to anchor this through bipartisan legislation. So the same way in 1979, the Sri Lanka Export Development Act was transformational at the time.
Right.
It set up a new institution, what we call a TPO, Trade Promotion Organization. It set up the Export Development Council of Ministers to ease up any issues faced with exporters at the level of the president, where he chairs the EDCM. And it set up the Export Development Fund. So at the time, I'm not saying all of those are necessarily relevant today, but at the time, it was path-breaking and it was legislated, it was anchored.
Right.
To this day, a lot of the things function around that because it was anchored in law. I think Sri Lanka needs a new international trade act or something around those lines that is approved in Parliament. It's not just a policy that can be reversed. Some form of legislation that anchors all of these reforms. And alongside that, we can have, the trade adjustment program, which we were planning on actually legislating as an act, which complements a dramatic trade liberalization to ensure that firms and workers who might find it hard to adjust to the new trade regime are given time to adjust. So all of these things can be done, and I have more faith in a legislative process than something that's just a nice policy that governments come up with. And on the tax side, I think a lot was done already through the Inland Revenue Act, which was brought in to try and streamline. So I think on the tax side, reducing the over-reliance on border indirect taxes by legislating those things within the tax-related acts, I think would also help.
Right. So you were in your last Indian government, you were involved in the national export strategy and drafting that document. So where is it at right now in the kind of implementation stage, and did it involve these kind of legislative initiatives that you were talking about?
So the national export strategy was unique in that it had broad buy-in from both the private sector and the public sector.
Right.
In fact, the private sector for the first time played a role, probably a leading role, in crafting most of the plans of action. So it wasn't this pie in the sky strategies or actions or not stuff that a public official hatched in their ministry rooms. It was very much commercially oriented stuff. Within those plans of actions, there were a bunch of areas that are relating to laws, amendments to laws and regulations that were identified. So it wasn't that the strategies need to be legislated, these were strategies, but the necessary legislative changes to help achieve some of those objectives were listed out, and details were given about what was wrong with the existing act, what needs to change, and they were kind of different parts. So there were existing regulations that were no longer fit for purpose for those sectors. There were existing, so they need to be kind of wholesale reformed. Existing regulations or laws that were seen to be good, but had some gaps to bring them up to date.
Right.
And then there were others that were complete gaps. So a new emerging area that would need new legislation to help. So
it was a whole package of.
It was a whole package, and there were those kind of things that require legislative work, but there were also very short-term, quick things that could be done and actually were done.
Right.
In terms of the status, I don't know now where it stands, but it was probably one of the only national kind of efforts that was not killed when a government changed.
Right.
And I was very impressed to see when the government changed in late 2019, 2020, the trade minister and key officials said, we will continue with that. So that was good for stability. Mm-hmm. Private sector kept also, because they were so invested in this, they kept agitating to keep doing that. But ultimately, you need very high level attention. There's a lot of competing agendas and activities on government's table. Mm-hmm. And you really need to care about exports and care about strategic promotion of exports. To get it done, you need some money behind it. We did a bunch of stuff with the IT industry to support. So I think what was good about this was that it identified things that can be done and should get some support without getting into all areas. Mm. But I go back to the point about the trade policy orientation. All of these will help probably at the margin. Right. Really helping to identify new sectors, getting stakeholders from the public and private sector to envision where a sector could go ahead and what initiatives need to be done. But if you don't have that overall export-oriented trade regime, export-oriented FDI and broader incentives regime, these things can only have an impact at the margin. You won't see that dramatic increase in trade.
Mm. So we spoke about the incentive structure being a key thing. Another thing that was subject to a lot of debate was about FTAs. Mm. We've had I would say, a big debate about that in this country. At least, I don't know, as a kind of intellectual debate, but certainly there was a lot of action on the street against these and so forth. So another thing that sometimes economists talk about is that FTAs also have this capability to anchor reforms, because it's not very easy to go and renegotiate a trade agreement. So it can help sort of get the reforms through changes in government. So how do you see the role of FTAs now moving forward, and also of unlocking the sort of export potential of the country?
So a lot of things that to unpack. One is that the value of FTAs in large part is that, particularly bilateral, I think we're largely talking about bilateral FTAs here, is that it unlocks market access to the bilateral partner,
Sure.
which you won't necessarily get if you do unilateral. But I think we should talk about unilateral also at some point. So that's one. You get market access, preferential market access, which hopefully your competitors don't have. And our side note there is everyone has gone speeding ahead on FTAs. So I can't imagine a lot of countries that Sri Lanka would have a big advantage by doing a bilateral FTA and getting preferential market access, because that bilateral partner probably has signed a dozen more FTAs with others, including our competitors.
Right.
So that's one. And on the point about anchoring reforms, agreed, it does help to anchor reforms only if they're good FTAs.
Right.
So if it's a plain vanilla trade in goods agreement, which is all we have right now except for the recent Singapore agreement, these don't really help to anchor larger reforms, right? You're just making a bilateral deal. You don't have to, because it's only trading goods, you don't really have to have done a lot of other reforms in other sectors, in services, in investment, in government procurement, intellectual property, labor, none of those things. So there isn't really an anchoring of reforms when it comes to bilateral FTAs.
Sure.
But some of the new generation FTAs, and we took baby steps in that direction with the Singapore-Sri Lanka FTA, where it includes some of those, as well as in some of these what's called mega regional FTAs, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is in Asia, the CPTPP, which is the successor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. These are much more comprehensive, and these, I would argue, do help to anchor reforms.
Right.
Vietnam is a classic example. They want to do a whole bunch of things which were going a little slow. They managed to do it under the kind of the ambit of accession to these agreements, because they are quite deep. They are not your superficial, plain vanilla, what Professor Premachandra Advocata calls Mickey Mouse FTAs.
Right.
So I think that's the distinction. With trade in goods, kind of narrow FTAs, you don't get that anchoring effect. With more than just goods agreements that you do bilaterally, you probably might, but you really get it only with those mega regional new generation FTAs that we're seeing, because the ask is so much.
Right.
Just on the point about Singapore, I'll give an example of a reform that was done, that was on the shelves for so long, but got catalyzed because of the Sri Lanka-Singapore FTA, and that is the Anti-Dumping and Countervailing Measures Acts. These had been on the back burner, on a shelf, drafted for so long and kept. But it's because we wanted to install this before the Singapore-Sri Lanka FTA became active, this suddenly was dusted off the shelves and Parliament passed it.
Right.
So that small example, but an example nonetheless of how more comprehensive FTAs help you to get more of the other reforms done. But again, not unless you talk about these mega regions do you really get things done.
So since you mentioned the Singapore FTA, right? That is not necessarily kind of market access one, in the sense that Singapore is pretty much kind of a free trading country, right? So what was the logic of that Singapore FTA really? Because you were in government when that was sort of signed. What actually did happen in that?
Signed and fully enforced.
Right.
May 2022, a few months ago, was the 4-year anniversary of it coming into force. It was signed in the January of that year. So it's been now 4 years in force. Clearly, Sri Lanka-Singapore FTA was not about getting market access. It was about attracting investment, particularly investors from Singapore, as well as those others who are based in Singapore, because for the first time, Sri Lanka signed an agreement that goes beyond goods. It has an investment chapter, a services chapter, economic cooperation chapter, and a whole bunch of others. I think there's an information technology chapter as well. So the idea was not to try and get market access to Singapore, but to attract investment, the trade investment nexus. And one might have the argument that investment is protected in general in Sri Lanka. So why did we need this? Very clearly, in all of my interactions with investors, Singaporean investors as well as others, they've said having a bilateral comprehensive agreement that isn't just a bilateral investment treaty or isn't just based on your own domestic laws. We've committed to doing something together, and that signals a lot. It has arbitration chapters and so on. So one purpose was that. The other was a soft one, I think. It was a signaling.
Right.
Signaling to the world that we are moving now from those plain vanilla goods agreements to more comprehensive agreements, signaling domestically and internationally, and signaling to ASEAN that we want to do more business. Because we've never had a trade agreement with an ASEAN country. And it was strategic because Singapore was the chair of ASEAN that year. So it had a few different elements to it. And of course, the plan was to then build on from there. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And again, what we see with a lot of agreement negotiation periods, in that process, you begin to lift the veil of poor regulations or distorted regulations or outdated regulations in your home country.
Right.
And it helps you to really look inward and start fixing those. And I saw this happen with the Singapore-Sri Lanka time as well, whether it was the lack of the anti-dumping and countervailing which had to come in, whether it was government procurement-related issues, services, investment. It may not anchor the reforms, but it certainly lifts the veil on the areas you need to be doing reforms.
Sure.
And it really helps catalyze those getting done in the government side. So yeah, I think that helps. And we saw this with the negotiations on the ETCA, upgrading of the FTA with India. Even then, a lot of the discussions were about fixing what was wrong with the bilateral goods FTA, figuring out all of those pieces that need to be done even before we sign. So these things do have a usefulness, but it's certainly not the end all and be all of reform.
Mm-hmm. So moving towards those kind of high quality multilateral agreements, let's say, is that really realistic right now for Sri Lanka, or is that something we can really aim towards, even though we are going through this kind of crisis, taking into all of that into consideration? What are some of the sort of goals that Sri Lanka can aspire to in this space of trade agreements?
So, Deane, my thoughts around FTAs have evolved over the last few years. I'm no longer a proponent of bilateral FTAs as the way forward. It's not because they're not useful, it's just that I think they're a waste of time.
Right.
Especially in a country like Sri Lanka where we have such limited capacity. Mm-hmm. Do you want to spend that limited capacity on getting a bilateral goods agreement with a Thailand or a Bangladesh or that next other country we like to? Or are we going to use that to get more bang for buck?
Right.
So that's why I think our focus now should really be on making initial steps, overtures, particularly the RCEP. I think it'll be relatively easier. It's not going to be easy, but relative to, say, CPTPP, which is very deep, RCEP less deep, and China being a proponent of it could help us. So I think this fantasizing anymore about doing more and more bilateral FTAs should be out. We should spend our time and energy on forging agreements that we do the hard work and we get access to much more. We do the hard work and it anchors some reforms. So that's I think where our focus should really lie. In terms of where to start, we need to hugely increase trade negotiating capabilities.
Right. In terms of capacity.
Capacity in key institutions. We're out of practice.
Right.
Right.
We haven't done this for a while.
We haven't done this for a while.
Right.
And
then how do you address that gap? Like, is it temporarily some foreign help, getting some technical expertise? How do you see that going?
So I think a combination of several things. Definitely getting technical expertise, and in fact, there was a ITC-led program in the past to build that kind of capacity, particularly around anti-dumping, countervailing, a new a new unit at Department of Commerce was established. So like that, we would need help. And I just want to give for anyone thinking, gosh, how can our international trade negotiations or capacity or institutions like DOC welcome foreigners? Look at Britain.
Right.
When Brexit happened, they realized they have no capacity for forging new trade agreements. They've had no practice. They welcomed a whole bunch of foreigners. Like a former colleague of mine, she had worked on trade policy in Argentina. She worked with us at the ministry as an intern. She was picked up by the Department of International Trade there, and she works in one of those key offices. So they welcome people from all over because they knew they don't have the capacity. So do they then just go on, training people over 10 years, or do they quickly try and crowd in that capacity? So I think it's a combination of getting that technical help, but also doing the hard work domestically. And I think increasingly, because trade is so multidimensional, we can't just have narrow focused trade negotiators. They have to understand the linkages with the rest of the economy, the different pressures coming from labor, from environment, from domestic vested interests, and they have to understand how to communicate.
Yeah.
So you just can't have good, narrowly trained technical people. We have to build up their capacity in all of these other things, because otherwise they're not going to be able to function effectively.
So Anush, you spoke about how kind of your own thoughts have evolved around FTAs. We had, I think, as I mentioned earlier, some episodes of extreme opposition to trade agreements. So ETCA comes to mind. I'm employed in the IT sector, which is supposed to be very outward looking, etc. And it is actually. And I was surprised to see my colleagues joining these protests, thinking that in Indian software engineers are going to come and steal our jobs or something like that. So that is something that you had to deal with while you were in government as well, in some sense. Do regional trade agreements like RCEP, etc., do you think they are sort of less politically sensitive and therefore more plausible in some sense? Because it seems like we're spending a lot of, you mentioned effort, but also political capital on negotiating some of these, say the Indian agreement, because it's easy to sort of demonize one country. It's perhaps harder to demonize an entire region, especially when Sri Lanka is kind of going through what we're going through and actually receiving aid and support from all these countries. So how do you see the politics of this and working out, especially if we are to move towards more of those higher quality trade agreements you're talking about?
So I'm not convinced that whether it's a bilateral FTA or a mega regional or sub-regional, that the level of opposition would be less or more or different. I think we have to look at often why some of those concerns or apprehensions. And I know hindsight is 2020. I've had to reflect a lot on what we did and didn't do during that time, and what lessons I would take for myself, I think, if we could do some of those things again. First reflection probably is understanding what those drivers of opposition were.
Right.
What was causing people to be so anxious? Sometimes it's sinister, politically motivated,
Sure.
sometimes funded by vested interests.
Absolutely.
But often not the case. I mentioned the point about the uneven playing field. A lot of the time, those apprehensions around greater trade liberalization stem from pain that those firms are feeling with the domestic operating environment, not feeling like the regulatory environment is rigged in their. They feel it's rigged against them, but in favor of imports. So things like that. Another driver would be no clear reform pathway. So you're telling me about this particular FTA or this particular trade reform, but how does it fit into the larger transformation? And if I don't see that as a stakeholder who's already nervous about trade liberalization, I can't see what this larger change is for. And I think painting that reform pathway was important. And also these domestic competitiveness constraints that hurt businesses, whether it's on the doing business, ease of doing business kind of stuff, electricity, rigid policies and regulations that haven't been updated. So again, there's a worry and an apprehension. We have to deal with all of these domestic competitiveness constraints, and on top of that, you're telling us we have to compete with imports. Worries them. So I think the first point is understanding what those drivers are and doing a lot to either ease whatever can be eased quickly, or at least showing that things are being done. The second was, second reflection probably is painting a picture for the gains of trade. So you said, you and I would probably agree, that trade is important, opening up is important, but that's perhaps because of either our own ideology or we have seen why it has worked, or we've read it, studied it, spoken to businesses. A lot of people may not have that. And to assume that they should intuitively get that trade is good, intuitively get that opening up or liberalizing is good, is perhaps unfair and unrealistic. Painting the gains from trade involve, like I said earlier, showing the wage premiums that employees in export-oriented businesses get. Doing some modeling work that throw up numbers that everyone can cite about the potential gains from trade. We try to do some of that work with the World Bank, and putting some of those numbers out there. And the third, I would say, reflection I have is tackling of opposition in a very systematic and determined and structured way. You can't just keep reacting to everything that someone brings out. I felt we did a lot of that. And we were playing to the narrative of whoever was opposing it. Later, I learned a lot from how Australia had done it, including the Australian chief trade negotiator, who said, we tried to communicate as much as possible on our terms. Whenever there was an update about progress of an FTA negotiation, we would openly come out and say, this is what we've done. A lot of that meant that over time, people felt, okay, maybe I don't need to worry so much. The government is telling me when things are happening. The government is telling me where the negotiations are, or what degree of trade liberalization we're going, what timeline in which to expect it. And then that's on a more benign end. But at the other end of the spectrum, I think where we see opposition being really unfounded or unfair or sinister, really going after that. And exposing that. So
Instead
that people
of just running scared and reacting.
Exactly, running scared. And I'll give you a classic example. I hope I don't get into trouble for talking about this, but I remember at one meeting for one of these trade liberalization stakeholder negotiations, we had one group that we knew were problematic. We knew had been going out there spreading false messages, unfair messages. And they were still invited to a stakeholder conversation alongside respectable business chambers who had contested with our ideas on a very structured, legitimate, decent way. So we gave both groups an equal seat at the table, which I don't think is fair. Secondly, during the meeting, they started distributing flyers, propaganda flyers, against the agreement, against trade, against. I mean, that's absurd. We should have chucked them out of the room then and there, and set the tone that we are open to talk with you, we're open to talk with anybody, but come at it constructively and decently, and we'll talk to you for days on end if you want. We'll be very open with you, but this is not tolerated. So I think both strategies. The first is being very open, coming out and on your own terms, communicating effectively, and over time giving the perception that the government has your back. We are looking at all stakeholders. We are not driven by a vested interest. We are driven by a national interest around trade. But at the other time, finding those folks who are more sinister and making sure their voice is not as equal, certainly not, at least not as equal as those other more credible outfits.
So Anush, to kind of wrap things up, we are in the situation we are in now. Above, all these problems, we are in a massive economic crisis, or the worst of certainly you and I's lifetime, right? And we have the problems that we have that we spoke about. You have a business elite sometimes that has interest in keeping things the way they are. You have an economy that is not delivering in terms of export diversification at a deeper level. Yes, you mentioned that there are some happy news at the margins. So how do you basically bring all of this together? What is the path forward realistically in the position that we are? What would you do if you were back again at it, doing those very tough and perhaps enjoyable things sometimes at the ministry? What would be the path forward for a reset?
So I like that you use the word reset. It's part of the broader theme here. And the more I've thought about it, particularly over the last year or two, I think we cannot tinker on the margins.
Right.
Whether it's pursuing bilateral FTAs or doing a little bit of unilateral para-tariff removal here and there, I just think it's not going to be worth it.
Right.
The political capital you're going to need to spend, the limited bureaucratic competence that you'd need to channel, let's get bigger bang for buck and let's reset. I think, there will be pain, but we have to understand why we are doing it. And if we are saying we're doing it to get that much better, get a little more attention on the global arena, we're not going to get anywhere. And I work on a few countries in the region. They're all thinking about attracting global capital. They're
Right.
all thinking about plugging into global supply chains. They're all thinking about how to get attention on the global trade stage. How are we going to stand out if we're just going to tinker on the margins and do a little bit here and there? So I think now, with everything that has to change anyway, with dramatic shifts we're seeing anyway in policies, you're hearing about SOEs potentially being privatized, restructured, a real commitment potentially. Why not on trade?
Absolutely.
Let's use the opportunity to really reset, stop tinkering around the margins, because not just for intrinsic value, not just because it sounds nice, I think there isn't enough capacity in government to do a whole bunch of little things and hope for the best. And externally, I don't think we have the luxury of time, and only if we show real big, bold changes could we even be seen on the map again, and actually get investors looking at us. Otherwise, we'll have 50 million, 100 million, 200 million of FDI every year and export-oriented FDI, and then we'll be happy that some things are happening. We'll be happy that at the margin there are really clever businesses going out there, breaking into international markets, and we'll hear good stories of one or two companies in the daily papers, but we won't get that dramatic change. And what that means is we won't get the kind of income increases in Sri Lanka, good export-oriented jobs that we need. So I think I hate this word big bang reforms because it sounds like there's going to be a lot of damage when there's an explosion. But I think something that is ambitious and bold enough that gets the job done domestically and gets the job done in terms of our positioning globally.
Anushka, with that, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.